The hospital security camera captured the moment that would change everything. A German Shepherd therapy dog named Atlas padding quietly into the pediatric intensive care unit at 2:47 a.m. His handler Sarah Chen, following with concern etched across her face, and both of them drawn by something neither could explain toward room 412, where 6-month-old Emma Rodriguez lay dying from a rare heart condition that 3 surgeries had failed to correct. Her tiny body covered in tubes and monitors that beeped their steady countdown to an inevitable conclusion her parents couldn't bear to accept. And what happened in that room over the next 72 hours would not only save Emma's life in ways medicine couldn't explain, but would fundamentally alter how the medical community understood the healing power of the human-animal bond, and remind a cynical world that miracles still existed in the spaces between science and faith, between protocol and compassion, between what we think we know and what we've yet to understand. Sarah had been a therapy dog handler at Children's Memorial Hospital for 5 years, bringing Atlas and other certified animals to visit young patients who needed the comfort only a gentle creature could provide. But she'd never seen Atlas behave like this. The normally obedient dog had pulled away from his scheduled visit with a teenager recovering from surgery, and instead insisted on going to the PI, a restricted area where therapy animals rarely went because the children there were too fragile, too compromised. But Atlas had planted himself at the PICU entrance with such determination that Sarah had finally convinced the night nurse to let them make one brief visit, just to see what had drawn the dog's attention. And when Atlas had walked directly to Emma's room and sat beside her incubator with a focused intensity that Sarah had never witnessed, she knew something extraordinary was happening, something that transcended the usual therapeutic visits and entered territory that was harder to name but impossible to ignore. Emma's mother, Maria Rodriguez, had been sitting vigil beside her daughter's incubator for 6 days straight. Her eyes red from crying, her hope eroded to the thinnest thread, and when she saw a dog enter her daughter's room, her first instinct was to object. This was the ICU. Her baby was dying. This wasn't the time for pet therapy. But before she could speak, she watched Atlas do something that stopped her breath. The dog gently placed his head against the incubator where Emma lay, and for the first time in 48 hours, the baby's heart monitor showed a steady, strong rhythm, instead of the erratic pattern that had terrified every doctor who'd examined her. And Emma, who hadn't opened her eyes in 2 days, slowly opened them and looked directly at the dog through the clear plastic. And her tiny hand, which had been clenched in a fist, relaxed and reached toward where Atlas's nose pressed against the barrier between them. Sarah saw Maria's expression transform from exhaustion to wonder, watched the mother stand and move closer to witness this impossible moment, and the night nurse, who'd reluctantly allowed the visit, stood frozen in the doorway, her medical training warring with what her eyes were witnessing. A dying baby, responding to a therapy dog with vital signs that were suddenly, inexplicably stronger, more stable than they'd been since the last failed surgery. "What's happening?" Maria whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady beep of monitors that were now singing a different song, a hopeful one, and Sarah shook her head because she didn't have an answer, didn't understand why Atlas had been so determined to reach this particular child, or why his presence seemed to be creating a physiological response that medication and procedures had failed to achieve. She only knew that something profound was occurring, something that went beyond her training and experience into territory that science struggled to map. Dr. James Peterson, Emma's cardiologist, arrived within 10 minutes of the nurse's urgent page, expecting another crisis. Another moment of watching helpless as a baby's heart failed, despite everything medicine could offer. But instead he found stable vitals, a responsive patient, and a German Shepherd sitting perfectly still beside the incubator as if standing guard. And his immediate instinct was to remove the dog animals in the PICU violated protocol, created infection risks. disrupted the controlled environment. But when he reached for Emma's chart and saw the dramatic improvement in her cardiac function coinciding exactly with the dog's arrival, his scientific mind demanded he investigate before interfering. "How long has the dog been here?" Dr. Peterson asked, his voice tight with the conflict between medical protocol and undeniable results. And Sarah checked her watch. 17 minutes. And her vitals have been stable the entire time, before Atlas arrived. The nurse said Emma hadn't had more than 3 consecutive minutes of steady cardiac rhythm in the past 12 hours. Dr. Peterson studied the monitors, cross-referenced the timing, and made a decision that would either save his career or end it, depending on who was evaluating his choices. The dog stays, but we monitor closely. Any sign of distress, any decline in her condition, and the animal leaves immediately. We document everything. Vitals every 5 minutes, note any changes, and we don't tell administration until we understand what we're seeing. Agreed. The night nurse nodded, Sarah agreed, and Maria, who understood that her daughter's doctor was bending or breaking rules to pursue something impossible, said thank you for trusting what you can see even if you can't explain it yet. Thank you for choosing my daughter over protocol. The first hour passed with no change except improvement. Tima's vital signs remained stable. Her oxygen saturation increased. Her cardiac rhythm showed strength and regularity that her damaged heart shouldn't have been capable of producing. And Atlas didn't move except to occasionally adjust his position, always maintaining contact with the incubator. His breathing slow and measured as if he were consciously regulating it to match the baby's. And Sarah, who'd worked with therapy animals for years, had never seen anything like this level of focus and intent. It was as if Atlas understood his presence was medicinal, as if he were deliberately providing something the baby needed. By hour 3, other staff had noticed the anomaly: a therapy dog in the PI, a dying baby, showing improvement, whispers spreading through the night shift about something unusual happening in room 412. And Dr. Peterson made another unprecedented decision. He invited the hospital's chief of pediatrics, Dr. Rachel Winters, to observe, knowing she could shut down the entire situation, but hoping her scientific curiosity would outweigh her adherence to protocol. Dr. Winters arrived skeptical, her expression making clear her opinion of allowing an animal in the PIC, but she'd known James Peterson for 15 years, trusted his judgment. And when she reviewed Emma's chart and saw the documented improvement, when she witnessed the baby's steady vitals and the dog's unwavering vigil, her skepticism began to crack, not broken by belief in miracles, but by respect for data that demanded explanation. And she said, "This is either the most remarkable coincidence I've seen in 30 years of medicine, or we're witnessing something that challenges our understanding of healing. Either way, we need to document it properly, and we need to keep that baby stable. So if the dog is somehow contributing to her stability, the dog stays. But James, if this goes wrong, if she declines, we're both answering some very difficult questions." The decision made. The unusual vigil continued. Sarah brought Atlas water and encouraged him to take breaks. But the dog refused to leave the baby's side, except for brief, necessary walks, always returning immediately to his position beside the incubator. And Maria, initially wary of this unexpected intervention, began to see Atlas as an ally, a fellow guardian, watching over her daughter. And she started talking to the dog, telling him about Emma, about the pregnancy she'd thought would end in joy, but had instead become a nightmare of diagnoses and surgeries, about the daughter she'd held for only minutes before medical teams had swept her away, about the dreams she'd had of watching Emma grow up, dreams that were dying alongside her baby. And somehow, speaking these things to a dog was easier than speaking them to humans, who would offer platitudes and false hope. "I don't know if you understand me," Maria said during one of these quiet conversations. Her hand pressed against the incubator near where Atlas's head rested. "But I need you to know that if you're somehow helping her, if your being here is why she's fighting, then you're giving me the most precious gift anyone could give, more time with my daughter. Even if it's just days or hours, you're giving me moments I thought I'd lost, and I'll be grateful for that for the rest of my life." Atlas's tail wagged once, slowly, and his dark eyes shifted to meet Maria's gaze. And in that moment, Sarah saw something pass between mother and dog. Some understanding or acknowledgement that transcended species, and she understood that whatever was happening here wasn't just medical, it was profoundly emotional. It was about connection and hope, and the mysterious ways that love manifests. By the second day of Atlas's vigil, Emma's improvement was undeniable. Her cardiac function had stabilized at levels that suggested healing, actual regeneration of damaged tissue that her doctors had declared impossible, given the severity of her condition. Her oxygen levels were approaching normal. Her color had changed from the frightening gray-blue to a healthier pink, and most remarkably, she was alert, tracking movement with her eyes, responding to her mother's voice, showing signs of neurological function that had been absent for days, and the medical team was struggling to explain it, running additional tests, checking equipment, consulting specialists, all trying to find a rational explanation for improvement that defied their prognosis. And while no one was ready to declare the dog responsible, no one was willing to separate him from the baby either, because correlation wasn't causation, but neither was it something to ignore when a child's life hung in the balance. News of the unusual situation spread beyond the night shift, and by day 3, hospital administration was demanding answers, asking why protocol had been violated, why a therapy animal was camping in the PIC, why proper channels hadn't been followed. But Dr. Winters and Dr. Peterson presented the date objective, measurable improvement, coinciding with the dog's presence, and asked a question that silenced the bureaucratic objections. If something is working, if a patient is improving against all expectations, do we stop it because it doesn't fit our protocols? Or do we adjust our protocols to accommodate results? The administration, faced with potential liability on one side and a potentially miraculous recovery on the other, chose to allow the situation to continue under strict observation, with the caveat that if Emma's condition deteriorated, the dog would be removed immediately, and a full investigation would follow. Sarah, who'd been sleeping in a chair in Emma's room to stay with Atlas, called her supervisor to explain the situation, expecting to be pulled from the assignment, but instead found support. "If that dog is helping that baby, you stay as long as necessary. We'll cover your other visits. This is what therapy animal work is supposed to be about, healing, however it happens, wherever it's needed." The support touched Sarah deeply because it validated what she'd been feeling, that this wasn't just an unusual case or an interesting anomaly. This was why she'd become a handler in the first place, to facilitate moments when animals could reach people in ways humans couldn't, and Atlas was doing exactly that, reaching a dying baby, and somehow impossibly, helping her fight. Maria's husband, Carlos Rodriguez, had been dividing his time between the hospital and home, caring for their 2 older children who couldn't visit the PIC, and when he arrived on the 3rd day and saw the German Shepherd lying beside his daughter's incubator, saw his wife's face showing something other than despair for the first time in a week, and heard the nurse report that Emma had taken milk from a bottle that morning, something she hadn't been strong enough to do in days, he broke down completely, his knees giving out, his body shaking with sobs that came from a place beyond words, and Sarah watched as Maria held her husband while he cried. As this strong man who'd been holding his family together finally allowed himself to feel the terror and the hope, the grief and the gratitude, all at once, and Atlas, sensing the emotional storm, moved closer to Carlos, pressing his solid warmth against the man's leg, offering the same steady presence he'd been giving Emma. "I don't understand what's happening," Carlos said, when he could speak again. "The doctors said she wouldn't make it through the weekend. They said we should say goodbye, prepare ourselves, and now they're talking about improvement, about her heart healing, about possibilities we'd stopped allowing ourselves to imagine. And it started when this dog arrived. How is that possible? Dr. Peterson, who'd been reviewing Emma's latest test results, looked up and said honestly, I don't know. I have theories animals can lower blood pressure and heart rate. Their presence can reduce stress hormones, create physiological changes we're only beginning to understand. But the degree of improvement Emma's showing exceeds anything those theories would predict. So either we're witnessing an extreme example of animal-assisted therapy, or there's something else happening that we don't have the tools to measure yet. What I know for certain is that your daughter is better than she was 3 days ago, significantly better, and that improvement coincides with Atlas's presence. Causation, or correlation, I can't prove, but I'm not willing to interfere with whatever this is, until I understand it better. Carlos looked at the dog, at his daughter, at the monitors, showing vital signs that suggested life instead of death, and he said, then he stays, as long as Emma needs him. As long as whatever this is keeps working, he stays. The next breakthrough came during a routine examination when Dr. Peterson performed an echocardiogram to assess Emma's cardiac function, expecting to see the same severe damage that had been present since birth. The malformed structures that 3 surgeries had attempted to correct, but instead finding something that made him call for Dr. Winters immediately, something that made both experienced cardiologists stare at the screen in disbelief. Emma's heart was structurally improving. The malformations were less severe. The tissue showed signs of healing that should have been impossible given her condition, and while neither doctor was ready to declare it a miracle, both had to admit they'd never seen anything like it. Had no medical explanation for cardiac tissue regenerating in a 6-month-old baby who'd been actively dying 72 hours earlier. We need to run more tests, Dr. Winters said, her voice tight with scientific excitement and professional caution. We need to rule out equipment malfunction, operator error. We need to compare these images with previous scans. But James, if this is accurate, if her heart is actually healing. She trailed off because the implications were too enormous to voice without absolute certainty, and Dr. Peterson nodded, understanding that they were potentially witnessing something that would redefine what the medical community thought possible. The additional tests confirmed the initial findings. Emma's heart was healing, slowly but measurably, and while the doctors couldn't prove the dog was responsible, they also couldn't ignore that the healing had begun when Atlas arrived and continued as long as he remained, and that correlation, however scientifically unsatisfying, was enough to convince the medical team to continue the unprecedented arrangement. Sarah began documenting everything, not just Emma's medical progress, but the interactions between baby and dog, the way Emma's eyes would seek out Atlas when she woke, the way her heart rate stabilized whenever the dog was near, the way she seemed calmer, more responsive, more present when Atlas maintained his vigil. And Sarah realized she was witnessing something that would likely never be replicated in a controlled study, but was nonetheless real, measurable, and profoundly important, something that challenged the boundaries between medicine and mystery, between what science could explain and what it could only observe and marvel at. By day 5, Emma was strong enough to be held by her parents for the first time in over a week, and Sarah arranged for Atlas to be positioned beside Maria's chair so the baby could maintain contact with the dog, even while being cradled by her mother, and the image of Maria holding her daughter while a German shepherd sat protectively beside them, the monitors showing stable vitals and the mother's face showing hope instead of grief. That image was captured by a hospital photographer documenting the innovative therapy program and would eventually become the photograph that went viral, that touched millions of people around the world, that made Atlas and Emma symbols of hope and healing in ways none of them could have predicted. The medical team continued monitoring Emma's progress, continued running tests and documenting improvements, and gradually, reluctantly, they began using words like recovery and remission, and even, tentatively, cure. though that last word came with heavy qualifications, because no one wanted to promise something that could still be taken away. But Emma was undeniably better, was eating and growing and showing all the developmental signs of a healthy baby. And her heart, while not perfect, was functioning at levels that suggested she might live a normal life, might grow up, might have a future that had seemed impossible just days earlier. By day 7, the medical team made the decision to move Emma out of the PICU to a regular pediatric room, a graduation that signaled her improved stability, and Atlas transitioned with her, his visits now scheduled rather than constant, but still frequent, still clearly important to Emma's continued progress. And Sarah worked with the hospital to establish new protocols for animal-assisted therapy in critical care situations, using Emma's case as precedent for when animal visits might be medically beneficial, even in restricted areas. And while the bureaucracy was slow and resistant, the results spoke louder than any objection. And gradually, the protocols began to change, began to make room for healing that didn't fit traditional models. 3 weeks after Atlas's first visit, Emma was discharged from the hospital, her parents carrying her out to their car with instructions for follow-up care and medication, but also with hope, real hope, that their daughter would survive, would thrive, would have the life they'd dreamed of before diagnosis had shattered those dreams. And Atlas and Sarah were there to see them off, the dog's tail wagging as he sniffed the baby one last time, and Emma's hand reaching out to touch his fur, and Maria crying as she thanked Sarah and Atlas for a gift she could never repay, for being the inexplicable intervention that had given her daughter back. And Sarah said what she'd been feeling throughout the entire experience. "Don't thank me. Thank Atlas. I just followed where he led. And honestly, I think Emma called him somehow. I think she needed him, and he heard, and he answered. And that's something beyond my understanding, but I'm grateful to have witnessed it." The story could have ended there, a heartwarming tale of a therapy dog helping a sick baby. But what happened next expanded its impact far beyond one family, because the photograph of Maria holding Emma with Atlas beside them was posted to the hospital's social media, celebrating their innovative therapy program, and it was shared by someone who found it moving, and that person's network shared it. And within 48 hours, the image had been seen by millions of people around the world, all touched by the simple power of the moment it captured. Mother's love, a baby's resilience, and a dog's inexplicable healing presence and messages started flooding the hospital from families dealing with sick children, from people who'd lost hope, from others who found in this story a reminder that miracles still happened, that love manifested in unexpected ways, that sometimes the most profound healing came from the simplest source, unconditional presence and care. The hospital's therapy dog program saw a surge in volunteers wanting to be handlers, in donations funding expanded services, in requests from other hospitals wanting to replicate the program, and Atlas became a minor celebrity, featured in news stories about animal-assisted therapy and the mysterious ways animals could facilitate healing, though Sarah was careful to protect him from becoming overwhelmed, maintaining his regular schedule and normal life, because he was still just a dog, still just a good boy who'd done what dogs do, responded to need with presence, offered comfort without judgment, loved without conditioning. Those simple actions had somehow catalyzed a healing that medicine alone couldn't achieve. Dr. Peterson and Dr. Winters published a case study in a medical journal, carefully worded to present the facts without making claims they couldn't support, documenting Emma's improvement and its correlation with Atlas's presence, while acknowledging they couldn't establish causation. But the scientific community was divided in response. Some dismissed it as coincidence or placebo effect, though how a 6-month-old baby could experience placebo effect remained unexplained. Others recognized it as evidence of something worth investigating, of connections between human and animal physiology that deserved serious research, and gradually, slowly, The conversation began shifting from whether animals could facilitate healing to understanding how and when and under what conditions that healing was most likely to occur. Emma's recovery continued over the following months, her heart growing stronger, her development proceeding normally, and she remained healthy in ways that her original prognosis had suggested would be impossible. And while her parents maintained regular contact with Sarah and Atlas, visiting when possible and sharing updates, they also understood that their daughter's healing couldn't be attributed to a single source. It was medicine and mystery together, science and something else working in tandem, and they were grateful for all of it, for the doctors who'd fought for Emma's life, for the protocols that had been bent to allow Atlas access, for Sarah's willingness to trust her dog's instincts, and for Atlas himself. The gentle giant who'd somehow known that a dying baby needed him and had refused to leave until she was stable. On Emma's first birthday, a milestone her parents had once thought they'd never see, they held a celebration and invited Sarah and Atlas, and watching the healthy, happy baby crawl across the floor to pet the German Shepherd who'd kept vigil beside her incubator, seeing Emma's face light up when Atlas licked her cheek, witnessing this living proof that hope and healing could emerge from the darkest circumstances. Sarah felt overwhelming gratitude for the mysteries she'd been privileged to witness, for the reminder that therapy animal work wasn't just about training and certification and scheduled visits. It was about remaining open to those moments when animals demonstrated wisdom that humans didn't possess, when they knew what was needed before we did, when they offered healing that transcended our understanding and demanded we simply trust, accept, and marvel. Years later, when Emma was 5 and thriving, showing no signs of her early cardiac issues, beyond a small scar from her surgeries and regular cardiology checkups that consistently showed normal function, her mother would tell the story of Atlas's vigil to anyone who asked, and she'd emphasize that they never claimed to understand what had happened, never declared it a miracle, or demanded others believe it was divine intervention or mystical healing. They simply testified to what they'd witnessed. Their daughter was dying. A therapy dog insisted on staying with her, and during his presence she improved in ways medicine couldn't explain. Correlation or causation? They didn't know and ultimately didn't care. They had their daughter, healthy and happy, and that was enough. Atlas continued his therapy work for several more years before retiring to live with Sarah full-time, his career touching hundreds of patients beyond Emma. But that week in the PICU remained the most extraordinary of his service, the moment when his presence had somehow made the difference between life and death. And while Sarah would never fully understand how or why, she learned to accept that some forms of healing existed beyond explanation, required faith more than proof, demanded we trust what we observed even when we couldn't articulate why it worked. And that lesson, learned from a German Shepherd who'd known a dying baby needed him, transformed how Sarah approached not just her work but her entire life, opening her to possibilities she'd previously dismissed, to connections she'd overlooked, to the profound truth that love, in all its forms, including the love between humans and animals, was itself a healing force more powerful than any medicine, and that acknowledging mystery didn't mean abandoning reason but rather expanding our definition of what was possible to include things we couldn't yet measure or prove, but could, nonetheless, witness and experience and be transformed by. The photograph of Maria holding Emma with Atlas beside them remained the hospital's most shared image, a symbol of hope that continued touching people years after it was taken, and Emma, growing up knowing that a therapy dog had somehow helped save her life, developed a special love for animals and eventually announced her intention to become a veterinarian, wanting to care for creatures who'd given her so much, and her parents supported this dream enthusiastically, understanding that their daughter carried forward the legacy of that mysterious week when science and something beyond science had worked together to choose life over death, healing over loss, hope over despair, and that legacy, lived out in Emma's thriving existence, and her desire to serve animals was perhaps the most fitting tribute to Atlas and his inexplicable vigil, proof that healing ripples outward, that one dog's presence could change not just one life, but the trajectory of a family, a hospital, a community, and through the viral power of a shared image, touch millions of strangers who needed reminding that in our darkest moments, help sometimes arrives in unexpected forms, that healing happens in the spaces between certainty and mystery, and that remaining open to possibilities we can't fully explain might be the wisest response to a universe more complex and compassionate than our categories allow. And if a German shepherd named Atlas taught the world anything, it was that love transcends species, healing transcends understanding, and hope transcends circumstance when we're brave enough to trust what we observe, even when we can't explain it. And that trust, that openness to mystery, that willingness to let a therapy dog stay with a dying baby, despite protocols and procedures, that choice to prioritize healing over rules, might be the most profoundly human thing we can do. The most sacred acknowledgement that we don't have all the answers, but we can still choose compassion, still choose hope, still choose to follow the dog who seems to know something we don't, and trust that wherever he's leading, it's worth following.